The cards felt like stones in Abel's hand, heavy with the sweat of the last hour. Across the table, Finnegan's grin was a slash of yellow in the saloon's lamplight. His eyes, small and greedy, flickered from Abel's face to the dwindling pile of coins in the center of the table. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. It was down to the two of them. Abel had his ranch on the line, the one piece of the world that was his, a quiet expanse of dust and sky that held the ghosts of a better life. Finnegan had pushed all his cash in, then his horse, and finally, with a theatrical sigh of feigned reluctance, a folded piece of paper he'd pulled from his coat. "My last stake," he'd announced to the grimy onlookers. "The indenture for 3 fine workers, fresh off the boat from the east. Sisters, they are." The room had gone quiet then, a different kind of quiet. It was the sound of a line being crossed, even for a place like this. Abel had wanted to fold, to walk away and leave the man to his own particular brand of damnation. But he looked past Finnegan, toward the dark corner by the storeroom door. 3 women stood there, still as statues, their faces pale and unreadable. They were dressed in fine, high-collared garments that seemed to belong to another world, their dignity a silent rebuke to the squalor around them. He couldn't leave them to a man like Finnegan, so he called. Now, the final cards were down, Abel's full house against Finnegan's bluff. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Finnegan's grin evaporated, replaced by a snarl. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the glasses. "Damn your luck, farmer!" He shoved the pile of coins and the folded paper across the table. "They're yours." Abel didn't look at the money. He looked at the women. Their eyes met his, and for the first time he saw not emptiness, but a flicker of profound, terrifying uncertainty. He had not won a prize. He had won a responsibility that felt heavier than any mountain. Abel gathered the papers without reading them, his fingers clumsy. He pushed the coins into his sack, the metallic clatter grating on his nerves. Every eye in the saloon was on him, a mixture of pity, envy, and contempt. He felt their judgment like a physical weight. He stood, his chair scraping against the rough floorboards, and nodded toward the 3 women. His voice, when he finally used it, was hoarse. "It is time to go." He didn't wait for a response, turning his back on the jeering face of Finnegan and the curious stares of the others. He walked toward the door, the heavy sack of coins bumping against his leg. He heard the faint rustle of silk behind him, the soft, hesitant padding of their shoes on the dusty floor. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He simply trusted they would. For what other choice did they have? Outside, the summer night air was a relief, cool and clean after the saloon's suffocating heat. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky peppered with stars. The long walk back to his ranch stretched before them. He started down the dark rutted road, his own shadow long and lonely in front of him. The shadows of the 3 women followed, separate yet connected, moving with a grace that seemed out of place in this rugged land. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their steps on the dry earth and the distant cry of a lone coyote. He could feel their fear, a palpable thing that hung in the air behind him. He kept his pace steady, not too fast, not too slow. He wanted to say something, to offer some word of reassurance, but the right words wouldn't form. What could he say? That he was not like Finnegan? That he meant them no harm? They were just words, and words had likely been the currency of their betrayal until now. Actions would have to speak for him. They arrived at the ranch just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern horizon. The small, sturdy house stood dark and silent, a lonely silhouette against the coming dawn. The barn was a larger, darker shape beside it. Abel stopped at the porch, turning to face the sisters for the first time since leaving town. In the dim light he could see their exhaustion, the fine lines of strain around their eyes. The eldest, her gaze direct and challenging, stood slightly in front of the other 2. The middle one stared at the ground, a curtain of dark hair shielding her face. The youngest watched him with wide, frightened eyes, her hands clenched together. Abel gestured toward the front door of the house. "This is for you," he said, his voice quiet. He held up the key, placed it on the porch railing, and then pointed to the 3 spare rooms he knew were inside, clean and empty. "Rooms for you." He backed away slowly, giving them space. "I will be in the barn." He saw a flicker of confusion in the eldest sister's eyes, a slight furrow of her brow. She hadn't expected this. He turned without another word and walked toward the barn, his shoulders aching with a weariness that went deeper than the sleepless night. He didn't want them to feel like prisoners. He wanted them to understand, somehow, that the lock on the door was for them to use, to keep the world out, to keep him out if they wished. Inside the barn, the familiar scent of hay and dust filled his lungs. He found an old blanket, lay down in a clean stall, and stared up into the darkness of the rafters. The house remained dark. He listened for any sound, a door closing, a lamp being lit, but there was only silence. He had brought 3 strangers to his home, 3 lives now tangled with his own, and he had no idea what the morning would bring. The sun was high and hot when Abel awoke. He moved through his morning chores with a practiced efficiency, his mind elsewhere. He milked the cow, fed the chickens, and checked the water troughs, his gaze continually drifting toward the silent house. The front door remained shut. He wondered if they had fled in the night, though he knew there was nowhere for them to go. He prepared a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and fresh milk, placing it all on a wooden tray. Hesitantly, he approached the house and left the tray on the porch steps, knocking softly on the door before retreating to a safe distance. He busied himself mending a fence line, the rhythmic work a comfort, but his attention was tethered to the house. After an hour, he saw the door creak open. A slender hand emerged, quickly pulling the tray inside before the door clicked shut again. It was a small thing, but it was a start. Later that day, he saw them emerge. They moved together, a unit of 3, exploring the small yard around the house. They spoke to each other in low, rapid tones, their language a soft, melodic river of sound he couldn't understand. He watched from the field as the youngest, whose name he would later learn was An, knelt by his late wife's neglected flower garden. She touched a wilting rose with a gentle finger. The eldest, Leanne, kept a watchful eye on him, her posture rigid, her expression unyielding. The middle sister, Shufin, seemed to float in a world of her own, her gaze distant and sorrowful. He continued his work, pretending not to notice their scrutiny, giving them the illusion of privacy. As the afternoon wore on, he saw them begin to pull weeds from the garden, their movements careful and precise. They were bringing something back to life, and the quiet, determined act felt like a message. He was not their jailer. This was not a prison. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were beginning to believe it. A week bled into the next. A fragile routine began to form, an unspoken treaty between the solitary man and the 3 sisters. Abel would leave food on the porch each morning, and by noon it would be gone. He would work the ranch from sunup to sundown, and they would work in the garden, their quiet industry transforming the patch of dry earth into a place of burgeoning life. He learned their names by listening. Leanne, the leader, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Shufin, the quiet one, who moved like a ghost and sometimes hummed a tune so sad it made his heart ache. And Anne, the youngest, whose innate curiosity was slowly winning its battle against her fear. The first real crack in the wall of silence came one evening. Abel was sitting on the steps of the barn, cleaning a piece of tack, when Anne approached him. She walked slowly, hesitantly, her sisters watching from the porch. She held out a single, perfect white rose, freshly bloomed from the garden they had revived. She offered it to him, her eyes cast downward. "Thank you," she whispered, the English words soft and accented. Abel looked from the rose to her face, stunned. He took the flower, his calloused fingers gentle against the delicate stem. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with disuse. You brought the garden back." She nodded, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time. Leanne called to her from the porch, a sharp, worried sound, and Anne scurried back. But the bridge had been built. Later that night, as Abel prepared his simple meal over a small fire outside the barn, Leanne herself approached. She stood at a distance, her arms crossed. "Why?" she asked, her voice stronger than her sister's, laced with suspicion. "Why you do this?" Abel looked up at her, the firelight flickering on her serious face. He thought for a long moment before answering. "You are people," he said simply. Not cards in a game." He pulled the crumpled indenture papers from his pocket, the ones Finnegan had thrown on the table. He held them out for her to see. Then, deliberately, he tossed them into the fire. They watched together as the paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash. The burning of the papers was a turning point. It did not erase their fear, but it planted a seed of trust. The next morning, instead of leaving the food on the porch, Abel found the courage to knock. After a long moment, Leanne opened the door. She looked at him, then at the tray in his hands, and stepped aside, a silent invitation. He entered the house for the first time since their arrival. It was cleaner than he'd kept it in years, the air fresh, a vase with a few wildflowers sitting on the main table. Shufin and An sat at the table, watching him with wide eyes. He set the food down, feeling large and clumsy in the suddenly unfamiliar space. "Please," he said, gesturing to the food. He turned to leave, but Leanne's voice stopped him. "You, sit," she said. It was not quite a question, not quite a command. He hesitated, then slowly pulled out a chair and sat with them. The meal was eaten in near silence, but it was a shared silence, not an empty one. It was the first of many. They began to talk, slowly at first. They taught him their names properly, and he told them his. They spoke of the garden, of the weather, of the simple things that made up their days. He learned that Leanne was a fierce protector, that Shufin had a gift for cooking, turning his simple supplies into flavorful meals, and that An had a quick, bright laugh that was beginning to emerge more often. One afternoon he came back from the fields to find them on the porch, mending one of his torn work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He stood there for a moment, watching them, a feeling of profound gratitude welling up inside him. His lonely house was starting to feel like a home. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with presence, with humming, with the soft murmur of their voices, with life. But he knew this fragile peace could not last. The outside world, with its cruelty and its greed, was still out there, just beyond the borders of his land. The day came when their supplies ran low. The trip to the town of redemption was unavoidable. Abel felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He could not leave them alone, vulnerable, but taking them with him felt like a different kind of danger. He explained the situation to them that morning over breakfast. "I need to go to town," he said, "for flour, salt, things we need." Leanne looked at her sisters, a silent conversation passing between them. Then she looked back at Abel, her chin held high. "We go with you," she stated. There was no room for argument in her tone. It was a declaration of unity. They would face the world together. The walk into town was tense. Abel walked beside them, acutely aware of the attention they drew. People stopped and stared from doorways, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Whispers followed them like buzzing flies. The three sisters walked with their heads held high, their elegant clothing a stark contrast to the dusty, rough-hewn town, their composure a shield against the prying eyes. Inside the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, a decent man Abel had known for years, treated them with polite respect, though even he couldn't hide his surprise. As they were leaving, their arms full of supplies, the one man Abel had hoped to avoid stepped out of the saloon and blocked their path. It was Finnegan. He was drunk, his face flushed and his eyes mean. "Well, well," Finnegan slurred, his gaze crawling over the sisters. "Look what the farmer dragged into town. Showing off your winnings, Abel?" Abel stepped in front of the women, shielding them with his body. "That's enough, Finnegan," he said, his voice low and even. "We're just passing through." Finnegan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Passing through? I hear you got 'em set up real nice in your house. Playin' family?" He took a stumbling step closer. "They ain't family. They're property. My property that you cheated me out of." Abel didn't raise his voice. He stood his ground, a solid, unmovable presence. "They are under my protection," he said, the words clear and cold. "Go on about your business." For a long moment they stared at each other. Finnegan, fueled by drink and malice, and Abel, fueled by a quiet, fierce sense of duty. Finally, Finnegan spat on the ground and backed away. "This ain't over," he snarled, before disappearing back into the saloon. The walk back to the ranch was quiet, but the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer born of fear or uncertainty. It was the quiet of shared experience, of a battle faced and won. Abel could feel the sisters walking closer to him now, their presence a comfort rather than a source of tension. He had stood for them. He had called them his to protect, not to own. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed color across the sky, Leanne finally spoke of their past. She spoke of a village by a great river, of a father who was a scholar, of a life that had been stolen from them by trickery and force. She spoke of the long, terrifying journey across the ocean, of the promises that had turned to dust, and of the men like Finnegan who saw them as nothing more than objects to be bought and sold. Shufan and An listened, their own quiet sorrow reflected in their sister's words. When Leanne finished, there were tears in her eyes. "We thought we would never be safe," she said softly. Abel, who had spent years nursing his own private grief after his wife passed, felt his old wounds ache in sympathy. He found himself speaking of her, of the quiet joy she had brought to his life and the profound emptiness she had left behind. "This place was just a house," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "full of memories. Now," he looked at the three of them, their faces softened by the twilight. "Now, it feels different." In that shared moment of vulnerability, the last walls between them crumbled. They were no longer a rancher and his wards. They were four lonely people who had found an unlikely sanctuary in each other. Shufan, who rarely spoke, reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that spoke more than words ever could. An smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. The ranch was their home now, a fortress built not of wood and stone, but of mutual trust and shared humanity. The peace was shattered a few nights later. The dogs began to bark, a frantic, aggressive sound that pulled Abel from a light sleep in the barn. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding. In the distance, against the moonlit horizon, he saw 3 riders approaching. He knew at once it was Finnegan. Humiliation was a powerful poison, and Finnegan had drunk deep of it. Abel ran to the house, his mind racing. He burst through the door without knocking. "They're coming," he said, his voice urgent. "Finnegan." The sisters were already awake, drawn by the barking. Fear was plain on their faces, but it was mingled with something else, resolve. Leanne immediately herded her sisters away from the windows. "Stay in the back room," she commanded. "Bar the door." "No," Abel said, surprising himself. "We face this together." He looked at them, at the family he had somehow created. He would not hide them away like treasures to be protected. Their strength was part of this defense. He stood by the main door, his body tense, his mind clear. He was not a violent man, had never been in a real fight in his life. but the thought of Finnegan laying a hand on any of them filled him with a cold, hard fury. The riders stopped just beyond the weak circle of light from the porch lamp. "Abel!" Finnegan's voice cut through the night. "Send out my property. I've come to collect what's mine." Abel opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door open behind him. The lamp cast a warm glow on his back, illuminating the three women standing in the doorway behind him, a silent, united front. "They were never your property to lose, Finnegan," Abel called back, his voice steady and carrying in the still night air. "You need to leave my land." Finnegan laughed. "Your land? You're hiding what's mine on it. I got witnesses who saw you win 'em. The law's on my side." Finnegan dismounted, flanked by his two hired men. They were shadows, their faces obscured, but their hostile intent was clear. He swaggered toward the porch, his confidence bolstered by his companions. "I'm not asking again, farmer. Send 'em out." Abel didn't move. He felt Leon, Shufin, and An step forward, coming to stand just behind him on the porch. He could feel their presence, their solidarity, and it strengthened his resolve. "You will not touch them," Abel said, the words simple and absolute. He was just a man, with work-worn hands and a quiet disposition. But in that moment, he was a mountain. Just as Finnegan reached the first step of the porch, Leanne moved to stand beside Abel. Her voice, clear and ringing with defiance, cut through the tense standoff. "We are not property," she said, her English precise and sharp. "We are people. This is our home." Finnegan stopped, taken aback by her directness, by her courage. He had expected cowering, frightened women, not this formidable figure who met his gaze without flinching. Shufan and An stepped up beside their sister, their fear replaced by a quiet, powerful dignity. The three of them stood there, no longer victims, but guardians of their own lives, of their own home. Finnegan looked from their determined faces to Abel's unwavering stance. He saw not a lone farmer he could intimidate, but a family. He saw a unity he could not break, a moral force he could not overcome. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a sullen confusion. This was not the way the world was supposed to work. People like them were supposed to be weak, to be used. He looked at his men, who shifted uncomfortably, their appetite for a fight diminishing in the face of this strange, silent strength. With a curse, Finnegan turned. "This ain't worth it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He mounted his horse, and without another word, he and his men rode away, swallowed by the darkness from which they came, their malevolence defeated not by force, but by the simple, unassailable truth of human dignity. The morning sun rose on a world washed clean. The thread had passed, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The four of them gathered around the kitchen table, the familiar ritual of breakfast feeling new, sacred. The silence was easy, comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of what they had endured and overcome together. Abel looked across the table at the three women who had so unexpectedly entered his life. He saw Leanne's fierce strength, Shufan's gentle resilience, and An's bright, hopeful spirit. They were not a burden he had won in a card game. They were a gift. They had saved him from his own crushing loneliness as much as he had saved them from Finnegan. The ranch, once a quiet monument to his past and his grief, was now vibrant with a future he had never dared to imagine. It was a sanctuary they had all built together, a testament to the fact that a home is not just a place, but a promise of safety, of acceptance, of love. Outside, the summer day was bright and full of possibility. The garden they had nurtured was in full bloom. Abel watched as An laughed, a pure, happy sound that filled the small house with light. He was no longer a lonely rancher. He was part of a family. And they were, finally, home.